Hi, everyone, and welcome to this evening's launch of the new GSD student journal, Pairs. I'm Sarah Whiting, Dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Design. First, a quick reminder about some of the features you'll see in this Zoom webinar. The Pairs founding editors and Giovanna Borasi will respond to questions during the final 30 minutes of this event. So feel free to submit your questions anytime in the queue by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have live captioning available for this event, so to enable captions, just click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, I want to invite you to tune in to some additional GSD programs that are happening this week. On Thursday, March 4th at 7:30 p.m. Cambridge time, we'll be joined by Julie Bargman, who's founder of DIRT, that is Dirt Studio, who will deliver the distinguished Dan Urban-Kiley lecture on her work with regenerative landscapes. And on Friday, March 5th at noon in Cambridge, landscape historians Thaisa Way, Edward Eigen, and Raffaella Fabiana Gianetto will come together to investigate the role of history in the cultural relations of site and landscape. All GSD lectures this semester take place via Zoom and require registration. More information about these events, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. And now for tonight's event. We put out a call a little over a year ago for a new school-wide journal that would be entirely student-led and that would capture the contemporary moment from our students' perspective. That's not an easy mandate, given the variety of programs and the even greater variety of students that we have here at the GSD. We received 17 fantastic proposals, confirming to my great relief that the future of the printed page is alive and well. In addition to the challenge of trying to find a format and content that would speak to the range of our school, the editors had to come up with both a format and a process that would be elastic enough to work for years to come. The appeal of Pairs is that it hits this flexibility through precision. The journal pairs subjects and objects. It invites us to look and carefully consider objects, which is exactly what all of us at the GSD do, with the understanding that objects is a broad term, encompassing design at all scales and in all formats. And I think that the sort of breadth of the term object will probably come up in this evening's discussion. The journal also pairs subjects with subjects. Each piece uses the interview format. Finally, it pairs the GSD with the world outside, with the intention of seeding conversations that come from, but aren't limited to, our GSD universe. These are conversations that are meant to converse with the world at large. I use the term conversation here very deliberately. We don't tend to give it enough due. A huge part of one's education, particularly here at the GSD, comes via conversation. Seminar conversations, desk crits, final reviews, and the myriad of conversations, serious and not, that take place in the trays. Writing in 1752, the British writer and lexicographer Samuel Johnson complained that we had talk enough, but not enough conversation. What's really the difference between talk and conversation? I'm hoping that distinction will come up tonight and come up in tonight's discussion, which itself promises to be a conversation rather than mere talk. Many people fail in conversation because they so enjoy talking they can't bear to listen. Here is Goethe on his meeting with Madame de Staël. He said, "It was an interesting hour. I was unable to get a word in. She talks well, but at length, at great length." Pairs describes itself as a journal dedicated to conversations about design that are down to earth and unguarded. But again, I would point to its success coming out of its precision in capturing the conversations that are relevant to this moment. Tonight's event is proof that Zoom has an ability to corral a global conversation. It includes the three founding editors, Nicolás Delgado Alcega, who received his MArch2 in 2020 and who hails from Venezuela, although he is currently located in Rome, much to my envy. Vladimir Gintoff, who is a dual degree MArch-1 MUP and who is slated to graduate from the GSD this May. Vlad hails from and is currently located in Connecticut. And Kimberley Huggins, an MLA-1 AP graduate from 2020 who hails from Toronto, but who is holding down the Pears Fort in Cambridge. The three founding editors will be in conversation tonight with Giovanna Borasi, who's an ideal interlocutor for this event since she's at once an architect, an editor, and a curator, and since January of last year, the director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, where she's been working as a curator since 2005. Borasi's work explores alternative ways of practicing and evaluating architecture. She focuses upon the impact of contemporary environmental, political, and social issues on urbanism and the built environment writ large. Her particular sympathy for the work required of journal editors stems from her 7 years as editor of Lotus International and Lotus Navigator, as well as her experience as deputy editor-in-chief of Abitare for 2 years. Borasi's latest curatorial project, Dear Architect, is a 3-part documentary film series that considers changing definitions of home and homelessness as a result of urban and economic pressures. This evening's event is not meant to be a comprehensive overview of the content of Pears issue number 1. We're counting on you to purchase your issues. Instead, it'll be more like a review or a quick conversation of the process and direction of Pears in the context of broader thoughts about writing, publishing, editing, and furthering design's discourse. Before I turn the baton over to Giovanna, I want to extend my personal thanks to Nicolás, Kimberley, and Vladimir for taking on what I think they never suspected would be such a time-consuming enterprise, and for giving the GSD a gift for years to come, Pears. Thank you. And welcome, Giovanna. I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, for welcoming us and for being the instigator of this new magazine. And as you said, you know, we think always that magazine they do not maybe have the necessity that we thought in the past in these days. But as soon as you see a good one like Pears coming up, you really feel that there is space for this content, this conversation. But so thanks a lot for launching this idea and for selecting this project and these 3 brilliant editors. So I have been able to look at it only digitally now, Pears. So my first question to our editors, I think Sarah clearly say what in her opinion Pears does and what the meaning of Pears means for the school and for the architectural field. But I'm curious to hear by Kimberley, Vladimir, and Nicolás, like why they have decided on this title. And we know that titles are crucial, and I know that doing a magazine who's supposed to last, the title should be precise, as Sarah said, but at the same time should also be open to evolution of the magazine. So what you intended with Pears?
Right. I mean, I think I have such a great respect for the process of naming things in general now. It took us a long time to end up with Pears. We went through pages and pages of different names. But I think for us, one thing that all of the names that we had gone through tried to encapsulate was this action of bringing seemingly disparate things together and then using the conversation space as a chance to transform it somehow within the conversation. And so, you know, that process part was really important to us. And I think one of the most obvious pairings that happen within the publication is certainly between the object and the invited guest. And it becomes an opportunity to try to draw parallels between the sort of history of the object and the work of a creative professional, or potentially even reject a sort of imagined parallel, which is also equally as interesting. But certainly, I think we were trying to pair and transform like a combination of objects with creative professionals, as well as pair them with specific student editors and specific questions. And I think that kind of layering, I guess, of pairings is really clear also in the process that we use to build the ultimate table of contents for each issue.
Vladimir, Nicolás, you want to add or something, or?
Well, maybe I'll add that I think part of our interest in pairing things, people and objects and people with other people, mainly with students, was because we felt that many times that the conversation was a very accessible format. We felt that a lot of people actually do read interviews when a lot of other formats are, we feel, less accessible right now, at least. And it kept, and the language of the conversation kept things in a way that everyone could in a way have access to it, regardless of the disciplines that they were coming from. But we felt that the interview usually fell into the trope of having people that are particularly experienced with interviews know what they're going to say and know how to switch the conversation into a couple of basic talking points. And so for us, the idea of pairing it with something was a way of forcing the participants into a context, first of all, to having to speak in that relationship to something larger than perhaps what they were particularly interested in, but also force them to think together with us about something rather than tell us about their projects or things that maybe are already out there in the press.
Certainly, there is something that also Sarah pointed to, the fact that there is this consistency of the fact that they are all conversations. So somehow there is also offered a consistency that in the format. So somehow you're going from one conversation to the other one, and even if they are not connected, and maybe we'll discuss a little bit how then you structure the entire issue or the entire, but you feel like that as you will be in a real space and you're passing from one place to the other one, and kind of like, I don't want to say in a party, then you pass through a conversation to another one, but somehow there is a certain intimacy in this conversation that are organized around an object. And so you feel like you have as a reader, you have a little bit of a privileged space because you are actually there listening to that conversation. So I don't know if that also was part of the idea of the conversation, of creating this kind of intimacy between the two people speaking, but also you as a reader.
I think that was definitely a factor, that we were interested in creating these kind of spaces between two particular individuals. And I think the analogy of a sort of party scenario is a good one for this, because it's not just putting two people in conversation necessarily. The format is also open to the idea that it could be a group of three people communicating, and that kind of adds an even greater degree of this kind of uncertainty or serendipity that I think we really wanted to strike in these conversations. And that, especially, I think, by putting a larger cast of people together, it was the opportunity to not really know how someone might respond to something else, and thereby shaking up what might have other been a fairly staid conversation about a particular thing. It just, I think, in a larger part, we just saw the conversation as a format as having a lot of potential in ways that it can be challenged and augmented and pose new possibilities in how we, in some cases, we have a conversation coming up. We're actually already working on issue 2, and one of them took place in 2 parts, and we're reconciling with now if that's going to be acknowledged in how we present it in the book. And I think there's just like a lot of different sort of factors of how the conversation itself it can be subtly altered and reconsidered through the format.
Yeah, and I also the analogy of it feeling kind of like a party, it can also work with how it can sometimes feel being at the GSD, where there's so much happening, and sort of so many conversations that you might want to be a part of, and almost you couldn't, I think, take advantage of everything. And so I think the use of people and objects as sort of fundamental elements for pairs was really to take advantage of one of the best and sometimes more challenging parts about being at the GSD, where there are so many people who are coming in and out, who are like flowing into the space and then leaving. And there are so many great objects and archives and collections, that you couldn't possibly, I think, really acquaint yourself with all of them. And so we saw this as an opportunity for us to really kind of take a minute, create a space to really focus, I guess, and have that intimacy with a person and an object very specifically, and sort of create those small moments where we can get to know each other.
You touch upon this of like, obviously this is a magazine that is led by students at the GSD, but somehow published by the GSD. So I'm curious to hear like what you thought in respect of like, it's not the magazine of GSD, so it's not you're not part of the, as it will be a communication of the institution somehow. But I think you navigate very intelligently this idea that this is a magazine that anyhow starts at the GSD and somehow is giving the idea of like what the place think, like what are the questions that are on the table, what are the people are passing by, what are the focus, and obviously in your editorial choice you select among those conversations and those topics. But somehow I wonder if you reflected also about this, that like we understand the character is very informal, are this conversation and are paired between two editors and maybe this idea of the object. But I found it in reading it, for me, was also very interesting because I felt I had from a distance the really understanding of what the school is talking about. So I don't know if this naturally came or was one of the intention also that you had.
I think Sarah prompted pairs a little bit as an element of the ecosystem of the school in her call, and we really tried to look at it as that. And so, of course, it's very literally a way of giving a voice to the student generation at the school, who is the one kind of in control now of setting what's the conversation with the people that the school has brought or created a relationship with in the last couple of semesters. But it's also, we think that opportunity is really interesting because it really does allow the students to frame back what the school is proposing. And so we think from an internal perspective, it's a really healthy element of the ecosystem of the school in that way. And it really gives a sense to everyone of what's the debate and what are the different positions from these two maybe sides of the community. But also it really, I think we didn't choose conversations because we like to do them or because we had ever done interviews. I think Vlad had worked on interviews a little bit, but it wasn't really something that was our interest. It was really the solution that we found to do this, as well as to bring a little bit of the conversation that was in the school, which we felt was very heated outside of the school, beyond, not only with other peer students or other people in our disciplines, but also maybe even a slightly broader context than that. And so it really was a way, I think what Kim was saying was very on point, which we said there's all these resources that this place has that is unique even to other comparable environments and other schools, which is that flow and abundance of material, of people, and of things happening, because it's such a large school. And so, what can we make with that that really is productive and isn't one more thing into that flow?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think that we viewed it as something that was simultaneously retrospective but also projective, in that we're looking at what's going on at the school to try to inform this current table of contents. But I think especially by employing the conversation as a medium, we were interested in trying to get at the things that haven't really been discussed yet and maybe pose new questions or new trajectories for the school going forward. I think in general, we were very much interested in seeing how we could be shaped by the school in producing the first issue, but also how the journal could subsequently inform the school or change the school in what we're projecting as being interesting to the student body and potentially a larger audience.
What I find extremely refreshing for me is that maybe it's the way I started to work that was always around the kind of thematic organization. Like as Sarah mentioned, I worked at Lotus for 7 years and was a thematic quarterly magazine. And so that has really kind of framed maybe my mindset, and somehow also the work I've been doing at the CCA is driven by a series of topics or a series of themes. And I found extremely refreshing the fact that you actually opted for a very different structure. So somehow, obviously, themes and topics comes out because of each conversation is fundamentally around one topic or one issue, but it's not a thematic overall magazine. So I'm curious to understand of how you decided to go about that. How many conversations you think are necessary to have to actually hold the number? So
yeah, no, it's an interesting question. Yeah, because it really isn't a thematic book at all. I think what is really fascinating because it's non-thematic is that there are actually a lot of threads that are fairly consistent throughout the 15 conversations inside the publication that were not intentional. Sometimes some interviewed guests actually brought up other interviewed guests who were in the book and would quote their work or something. And we tried to actually represent those moments inside the book and sort of share them as part of what's important to us as editors. But certainly I think, we chose not to thematize it because we thought what was really crucial to us was an opportunity to communicate openly, honestly, and to be shaken a little bit by something spontaneous. And we just found that, freeing ourselves from a theme would allow that to happen more easily.
And also thematizing conversations in a way would defeat the purpose, because I think the intent of pairs is to work together on something through conversation, to sit around an object in an archive, or to sit in a Zoom window and really work something out and take thoughts in progress and develop them, and then in that translation of the spoken word to the written word, really start to hash out what it was that was happening there. And in a way, thematizing would have defeated that purpose, because then if you go into the conversation knowing what you want to get out of it very strictly, then immediately you lose all the potential that the conversation holds. And we found as we started doing it, we had some initial threads that we thought were what we were all coalescing around, this 6 student editors that worked on this first issue. But in reality, we found that every time we would go into a conversation, 5 minutes later, it was about something completely different than what we thought. And that if we tried to backtrack, we were probably going to lose what was the really interesting common ground that had been found between the two speakers and what they were being presented with.
So the other things that I thought was very interesting again for me is that somehow you have a kind of large definition of what architecture is, and somehow this comes out. Maybe it's also in your background that maybe you also studied all at GSD, but in different in landscape or in architecture and so on. You have different backgrounds, but I found that throughout the conversation comes out also an idea that architecture is not just a building, and maybe we can go back also on this idea of what the object is, but somehow a lot of things come in the because of the choice of the object you have done, or because of the choice of the speakers you have done, but somehow it's really broadening. Like it goes from graphic design to architecture, obviously, to practicing, to landscape designing, and all kind of different. And so again, is this coming out because of the choice of the speakers, the choice of the people you have conversation with, or the objects, or is really something that from the beginning you thought like how we can have a magazine that also broaden the kind of discourse of architecture?
I think we were interested in creating what we felt was a holistic picture for the school, and the school is so many different things, being even just among the three of us. I mean, we represent 4 different degrees that are offered at the GSD, and I think the intentionality behind coming up with the table of contents and the types of people we were selecting in order to promote this kind of democratic vision of design was very much aligned with this notion that design means a lot of different things now. And I think there are a lot of different aspects that go into creating this sort of larger ecosystem that we put under the umbrella of design. So we have, the diversity of people, including someone like Chris Hawthorne, who's working for the mayor of Los Angeles as a design czar, and creating these kind of design initiatives to reinvent things like street lamps in Los Angeles. Or we're talking to one of my conversations was with Thomas Weaver, who's one of the acquisitions editors at MIT Press and is focused on architecture and art publications. And I think all of those things together kind of create this larger collective whole of what we think design is. And it was just about creating something that we felt was evocative of that breadth of difference, of different things that come into what make up the disciplines that we've decided to devote ourselves to.
I can continue to ask you questions, and maybe then there will be no questions for the people at the end. I don't know. But another fascinating thing for me was that, as you really said, like you introduce an object, and then this is a prompt to initiate the conversation. But then through the conversation, you actually discover that you learn other things. And when I'm saying learn other things, find information about the objects or the author, is that you really focus on other aspects that are part of the architectural practice. And this is part a lot of my interest. Like one of the show I have worked on some years ago was called The Other Architect, and was really very much about this idea of like, what are these other components of the discourse of architecture, if not just designing and building somehow. So I thought it's very interesting because when you are in, for example, in the first conversation between Kimberley and Peter Oudolf, you actually learn about editing. So it's very interesting because through his explanation about how he goes through uses photography or use the work in the garden, you actually understand how fundamental the act of editing is in the practice of architecture. Then you go into the conversation with Obrist and you understand all the kind of importance of the, again, is somehow the interviewing, but somehow his like the process of like how you actually arrive to this end, because you actually have prepared and also leave parts of to unexpected moments, but somehow you kind of prepare for what you want to have as a result of your design action somehow. And I thought it was very interesting the conversation with Suisse on the Olmsted book on the Kingdom Cotton, because you actually understand, the role of a kind of activist role that an architect or landscape design can have, and the responsibility and ethics that might have. So I thought it was very interesting that all the conversations start with an object. So what you get is the object, but at the same time you get the tools, like as a kind of side bonus. I don't know how you want to put it, but how as a kind of side bonus of learning about what means also to be an architect. So again, I don't know if this is all a chance or actually was really planned, but I thought it was another very interesting aspect of your conversations.
Yeah, I think it was, it was intentional and also somewhat unavoidable. I think, we did submit a response, a proposal to this competition prompt in the fall of 2019, but we really didn't get going until the spring of 2020, which I think like everyone knows how 2020 went. And so, in the context that we were in and that everyone was kind of swimming in, I think, you couldn't and you wouldn't want to avoid it. I think broadening the conversation in that sort of way and incorporating parts of responsibility and ethics and activism. And so, I think we wanted to include that while also keeping, design at the center of it, and to try and kind of give ourselves a bit of a roadmap into how we might want to practice ourselves in the future, by getting, I guess, courage from the stories of the people that we're speaking with. And so certainly that was, I think, a part of it. And we definitely, I think, the focus on seeing the conversations as like a process, is in part because this feeling that we maybe don't know how to do that, so that's a really big part of it, and I'm really thrilled to hear that it kind of comes through. And then I think the other part is just that, what Nicolás was saying earlier, which is that interviews tend to kind of go off the rails, pretty soon after it starts, no matter the amount of research that you put into it. And you'll always get what your intent was going into the conversation, but also where the person you're speaking to, where their head is at and where their mind has been. So it's sort of, both of those elements that I think are really playing a part, as well as what Vlad mentioned, trying to represent our students' interests, that sort of leads to that broadening.
But I think maybe this is also a question for you, because I think the question of what is the role of architectural in the broad sense, writing and criticism, is something that we do ask ourselves, and we've had conversations. Like one of the members of our team, Mark Bavoso, worked on Platt before this. We've been talking to some of the people working on the publication projects at Yale, and I think there's this general sense of you can do so much with writing that sometimes it's challenging to know, well, what exactly is the purpose of this for these design disciplines, for people that ultimately, in theory, are interested in going and affecting the built environment, objects, and all of these kinds of things. And it is a big question. And for us, trying to find ways to orient these efforts, these conversations, and these exchanges with people that really, in some cases, are people that are emergent and have interesting experiences. In other cases, are people that are maybe very experienced, and it's perhaps hard to relate to maybe how they got there, right? And trying to look for what feels useful for us in that process, and kind of in our search. And I wonder what it is that you found in what is now a career in architectural curating and in writing and criticism is really the fundamental role of that to the act of design, which is a totally different thing than what we're doing here, for instance.
Well, it's a big question, this one, Nicolás. I think what I like of magazines is that they are also the kind of mirror of the time when they start, and somehow it is like they really relate to what is felt needed in that moment. And I think some of the qualities that what you put are really reflecting put together are really reflecting this moment. So I will say this question of intimacy, but also transparency. I think there is a lot that is revealed also in the conversation about how people work, or like things that are not communicated, or like, I don't know, there is a certain openness and transparency that I think I cannot imagine in a kind of similar magazine like 10, 15 years ago. I don't know. So I think, I don't know, I like it really, and maybe I cannot disjoint my answer from like my own practice, a kind of activist role that the magazine should have in bringing forward things that maybe people do not know or do not care enough, and the fact that you believe that because you put it there, then become relevant. Because you are speaking about this, then become an argument to talk about. So I think this is a quality that a curator or an editor should look for, of like believing that what you are putting there is not important because you are the person doing it, but is important to create a discussion around that. So I felt like the choice you have done, for example, of the not only of the people you're featuring in the conversation, but the objects, and are actually doing that, of like taking things also from the past and re-understanding it now, or understanding how, if they're still relevant or not. I think that is a fundamental thing. So to continuously re-put in dialogue things of the history of architecture, or the history of landscape, or things of the past into today, I think is another fundamental act. And then it's important, is at the base of an architectural practice, I think, somehow to put themselves in a kind of timeline. But also, I think, is also to say what is important today. And I think, again, in your selection, you are doing it. So even if it's, as I said, you didn't put forward a topic, like you say, okay, let's say the first issue is about, I don't know, electricity. You actually selected the many things that are relevant, and somehow you start to understand the kind of discourse that is important today. So I think the role of editor or a curator, but I think even of an architect, is to be also a little bit anticipatory, like to understand maybe a little bit before others that this is relevant and important. But again, I'm giving this answer from my own perspective and my own way of doing things. So I'm sure that others will think very differently.
Yeah, because I think that's something we wondered a lot, is that this question of do we want to be absolute about this or make this kind of productive? And in a way, I wonder. I mean, I think when you're putting together an exhibition or working to bring an archive out with architects, as you guys do at the CCA a lot, is it, for us, the product is the kind of test for us to then go and see, well, what does this say, in a way, right? Rather than us to go and say, this is what we want to say, and here it is. And I wonder if there's always some of that, even in approaches that have more thematization, like you're saying.
Because I think until it's not put together, I guess, as the same as a building or a piece of architecture, until it's not put together, really is not there, and so you don't know exactly if it's saying what you meant, or actually in the moment that is used in the hands of someone, or is actually what it actually says. So. As I'm sure people will read it now, and you will have feedback if actually, and maybe you will find I think it's the most beautiful things for me. It's like when I curate a show, or that people will start to see things that I actually didn't see myself, and maybe we're there, but we're not like in my first. So I'm sure this will certainly happen with this project also. Yeah, But if we talk about the objects, like why are you, and maybe what also you mean with objects, like you cannot put a building as that's also the problem with speaking of architecture. So you cannot really put the building inside a magazine. And I felt was interesting that there is not any single really direct representation of a building in the magazine. So what is your idea of object somehow?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I think we didn't actually, in some ways, I think it's fair to say that we didn't really notice that we hadn't had a direct representation of a building until the book had been made, and we were like, oh, I hope that's not a problem. But yeah, certainly I think with objects, I think, I think we really liked the tangibility aspect. I think that sort of goes back to intimacy, and I think even the way that the book is constructed as kind of something small and something that can be handled really easily. I think all of these sort of decisions were in service of feeling like you could feel connected, with something, I think, and not maybe to get too metaphysical about it, but objects, I think, inevitably hold a lot of memory, time, effort, and maybe even the remnants of someone's hands on it. And I think these were all things that we really liked about the concept of bringing an object forward. And I think the idea of touching and holding and something that was kind of a vessel that you could be handled, really had it also sort of helped with that idea of kind of pulling down to a kind of closed, quiet space for a moment. And maybe in the future when, editors who work on this in the future are doing this in person rather than virtually, which, we've pretty much only done this virtually. At some point, maybe buildings can be brought into it, and it could be kind of a conversation that happens within a building. But certainly I think those sort of aspects were important to us when it came to objects.
I didn't mean that you need a photo of a building or a plan of a building. To speak about architecture, as you imagine, I don't mean that. I was interesting that the nature of the objects that you selected are also is also very specific. Also, way you represent them, the kind of archival dimension is very present. So there is an idea of also how the objects are contextualized in the magazine. That it's also a kind of suggests the idea that you're looking at that object, you are studying that object. So it's not just something that happened to be on your table. Somehow, I think is a very different use of objects that will be in other magazine that might use it just to give a kind of atmosphere of a conversation with a coffee cup. I don't know. So it's more the idea that is a prompt, but it's also that you have a kind of interest of like looking at that objects. Like letters are presented in a way that are readable. So it's nothing is an image. So that I thought is also a very interesting quality of what I read in what is your intention. Yeah.
I mean, I think this whole discussion sort of is circling around one of the major challenges of the first issue, which is that in doing this in the midst of the pandemic, of course, none of these conversations occurred in person. It was all virtual. And so, of course, the objects themselves were shared as kind of virtual entities. And so I think it's just an important point to bring up because the format shift was not something we had anticipated. Of course, we originally wanted to have these conversations in person and to be able to show the objects as real, physical things with our interlocutors. And with that not being possible, we, went with the route that we were afforded with the situation as it is. But I actually think that going through this on Zoom presented a number of possibilities that we weren't imagining, in part in some of the same ways. I think that events like this are possible, because of Zoom with people in all different places. And I think we similarly found that we could communicate with people who weren't even at the GSD at a particular time. And that was a real asset to us, was that it kind of enlarged the whole scope and vision of what was possible with the journal by not being restricted to just an in-person audience or being able to do it in person. And frankly, I think we've gotten really used to doing it on Zoom, and it's a really convenient way to get everything transcribed. We have like a really great system, I think, in place to execute the issues now. And so that'll be its own set of challenges, I think, as the project evolves and maybe more in-person conversations can take place and there's a more sort of tangible presence to this at the GSD itself.
I also would add that I think one of the great things about, we realized as soon as I think we were like a month or two into this, that 80% of the work was a kind of structural work of looking at this as a project or as a kind of tiny institution, because so much of it was about setting parameters for the journal to be able to have, as Sarah mentioned, enough flexibility moving forward, but also enough structure that it meant something and that people coming into it like knew kind of the where they stood in the range of possibilities. And the objects, I think, are one of the things that we thought was interesting is that you could approach it so many ways, and it really is a question. It's not a constraint, right? So you could do an entire issue on an archive that's been recently donated to the school, of the Office of an Architect, or you could do it with completely only conversations about what's on the desks, or you could do it. You could take more archival approaches. You could work in so many ways. You could use it to prompt participants with things that they're not expecting, or you could use it to have them talk about things that they're very experienced or have a lot of expertise in. And so I think this first issue is a kind of interesting experiment, and it is curious to look back at it and notice some of those things that you mentioned, because I don't think we realized that, the point about the architecture, but it's definitely telling, I think, about us, about the school, about what we were concerned with, about what we considered an archival object, which was a lot of what we were looking at, and also, like Vlad said, the challenge of looking at things on Zoom. I think one of the things that I remembered when he was talking is, getting people to talk about images whilst they're looking at each other's faces on the screen is really hard. And we think it's considerably harder than it is to put them around a physical thing, even if it's a photograph on a table. So we're curious to see how it evolves.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure this as you said, I think the magazine has a very solid structure in this defining in a kind of precise way these frameworks, but at the same time, the framework have also a kind of looseness, or like how you as editor will interpret them. So that's, I think, is actually a great way to actually define a structure for a magazine where you don't have to say decided the next 10 issues, so I think I understand this will be one issue a year. I'm curious because there are magazines that actually they define already their death at their birth. I don't think it's your case. No, I don't know. There are examples like Annie has decided it will only purposely, because that was like the meaning, like starting in the 90s and 2000 will end, so it was like 10 years. I think San Rocco did the same, so they decided they will only do a certain amount of numbers. So I hope you didn't decide already your expiration time or that, but of the magazine, I'm saying. But so
yeah, I think we're really looking forward to see how like future editorial teams will totally shape the publication in ways that we never expected, or even break certain aspects. I mean, hopefully there are things that stay pretty consistent, but we'll see how it kind of grows over time. I think I think we certainly know that there will probably be some sort of natural lifespan to this project, but I don't think we have any clue of what that will be, or how long it might go. But I think, we haven't also, kind of dictated what future editorial teams will work on in terms of like who they speak with or on what questions. Because we really want, I think, each editorial team to feel very much like they own it, and like it's their book, and so we hope that people feel that way about it.
I think also, I mean, we haven't established any sort of clear-cut number of issues or sort of scope of how long we think this project will go on. But I think, as you said earlier, Giovanna, that this didn't feel like something that maybe would have been possible 15 years ago. I think the sort of natural progression of time might, cause the project to yield on its own, that it sort of exhausts itself as a format, and that it's a useful exercise for a certain amount of time, and that it speaks to a particular moment, maybe in the style of conversations or the way that we've gone about creating these kind of interactions between pairs of people or groups of people, and that maybe in 2030 at the GSD, that just won't be the sort of most viable or most alluring way to sort of promote the design discourse to a larger audience and amongst our peers, and something else can emerge in its absence.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to speak about Anne in the moment that you heard. I was just curious if you thought about time and evolution of the magazine, but I think I get the sense, and I think it's really the strategy of this kind of openness interpretation of the framework that you established, that actually ensure its livability, also its long life. Yeah.
Yeah, the question of how many issues a year and timing, it has been a really complex thing, because we've been thinking, how do you do something that does have a kind of natural to, I think, any student publication, does have a little bit of a rebirth in every issue, but also there's enough continuity for it to actually be viable. I mean, of course, we've discovered it's very hard to put together something from scratch every time, right? And this originally, we had intended it to be published twice a year. so that we had a lot of, so that there was always a bit of overlap between editors. And so people that were just running interviews like, Linda, Mark, and Kyle in this issue are then being involved in kind of running the publication more in the next one. And that kind of life cycle of the team, I think, was a very big part of how often the publication came out of. But another was the question of timeliness. And I think 1 year in and having been able to put together both the kind of structure of the publication and this issue together, we are really questioning. I mean, like, how timely do we want to be, and how important is it that we're timely, and what does that say about the kinds of conversations that we should be having? And since it is kind of unviable for students that sometimes have not only to the school but even other responsibilities, offices or jobs, or at the same time, what is a viable way for this to be really productive and not kind of derail them from other things that they can be doing? And does that mean it is really once a year and there's anticipation to what happens, or is there a kind of more internal and informal way of discussing these things in real time at the school, and the kind of the publication being more about sharing that with the outside? And in reality, we don't have much of a say anymore, because the third team, second and third teams are already information, and I think in reality will be their decision to make a little bit how to think about this, but it has been a big discussion amongst the teams.
Yeah. No, I think the question of if it's crucial to be timely is a very good question, Nicolás, because we all find ourselves on reading things that are maybe in issue of Casabella of 30 years ago and are still very relevant, and maybe they were timely at that moment, but they are still timely now. I don't know. So it's a real question of it's like I think if there is a certain urgency around publishing, that maybe that urgency stays beyond the time when it's published. I don't know.
Okay, so I think I'll take this opportunity to begin to transition us into a Q&A period for the rest of tonight. Before we make that shift, and I really encourage anyone who's here with us tonight to ask ourselves and also Giovanna questions about our publication, but also the CCA or anything else. But before we move there, I would like to point out that there is a large portion of our team who is not here today and visible in our windows, and I would just like to really quickly take note of them. So, in combination with us 3 editors, there's also 3 associate editors who created really incredible conversations. Mark Bavoso, who is an architecture master student who's graduating in 2021, who is also the lead designer of Platt issue 7 at Rice University, created really great conversations with Pier Paolo Tamborelli and Michelle Chang. And he was actually the first of us to do an interview and really kind of set the standard, I think, for all of us, which was really exciting. He was very brave. And then we also have Kyle Winston, who's an architecture student who's graduating in 2022, who is obsessed with books. If you have seen any of the recent GSD student guides, probably designed and co-edited with Kyle, really running that. And we also have Linda Just, who will be joining us in a moment, who is a Master's of Design student who graduated with Nicolás and I in 2020 and was in the critical conservation stream, who ran incredible conversations with Oana Stanescu and Bobby Pietrusko. I also just want to say that the visual kind of creation of the journal was really the product of Renata Gra and Tim Curley, who were really instrumental partners for us, the Normal Studio in Chicago. And so anytime if you have a positive feeling about the way that Pears looks and feels, you should keep them in mind. And really quickly, and then we'll move on. We have advisors who were, incredible with us Jacob Reidel, the co-founder of Clog, Ken Stewart, Marielle Suba, of course, Dean Whiting, and Inez Zaluendo. So they were all incredible, and as well as in organizing this event, Paige Johnston, Matt Smith, and Kate Chavez. Okay, so yes, I maybe that gave us a moment to allow some people to submit some questions, I hope. Otherwise, we'll kind of roll with it. But yeah, let me pass it off to Linda.
Thanks, Kim. So thanks, Kim, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in online and sent us your questions throughout the course of the engaging conversation and are also currently sending us materials. So we've been collecting these thematically and will now submit a selection for response by our panelists. So under the heading of kind of definitions of objects, we had a question about what you consider cultural landscapes and integrated design systems like green infrastructure. Do you consider these also to be objects? And how are they addressed in pairs, or how can they be in the future as the critical areas of design that they are?
Well, maybe I'll say that I think for us, objects are things that allow us to talk about these things. And so whether those are drawings, whether those are, photo diaries, whether those are, whatever medium really allow us to kind of sit and really think about it. I mean, one of the formats that we considered for some of these conversations, which was COVID, were difficult, was actually going places, right? And finding a way to talk in places and really have that be the object of conversation, and finding an interesting way to really communicate those places appropriately for the audience that would be reading these conversations.
I think also having a rotating editorship and having people, some people who stay involved, but also new people who are constantly coming into the fold of working on this as a project. It's also at the discretion of people who want to be involved in this and want to see particular things come out of this as a project. And so anything is on the table. I think if you can find a way to create a conversation about it and have the appropriate person to be in conversation with, and just about, any sort of design object can be represented in a sort of documentary style of actually physically being there, and also just in the forms of drawings and other forms of representation. And I think the overall project is about trying to, in pairs, we're trying to convey this sort of breadth of how design is discussed, and it can be through a variety of means, and a variety of different things. Objects can ultimately yield fruitful and robust conversations about design.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think representing something like landscape, for example, I think it can absolutely be within an object, and it just sort of comes down to the way that you frame it. I think, just to give a few specific instances within this issue, the Arnold Arboretum is actually an object to talk about, public and private interfaces, and it's sort of represented through the 1,000-year lease document. Also, there's kind of a question about the whole history of the New England landscape, which is represented in the Harvard Forest dioramas that I think are a pretty well-known object, especially within the GSD community. And also we, in a conversation with Sarah Zaude, we had sort of the map of the Cotton Kingdom created by Olmsted, which again talks about landscape, but but through, at least through in the context of this publication, through the lens of this one map. And so I think, if you can find the proper lens, the object can be just about anything.
Building on that question, can you speak a bit about the sources for some of the objects that were within the collection and how it was decided upon to select from them? This question in particular earmarked items from the GSD's archives, but can you elaborate on where we drew from the larger context and what was the driving force behind that?
Yeah. Well, and I think also I'll just say, Giovanna, I'd be really curious to hear how this plays out, at the CCA level. But I think for us, I think we might have, I think the so many parts of this publication and creating this publication, there were so many parts that were unexpected. And so I think the length of this project really exceeded what we originally anticipated in part because of that. And so sort of, attaining the rights for certain objects that we wanted to bring into a conversation sometimes came into play there. But we sort of, in an ideal sense, didn't want the objects to feel too precious. Very often they are, very special items. But we wanted, in theory, for, kind of abandoned material in studio, for example, to also be a potential object at play. Because, again, it does say something about the design process. And so, when it comes to sourcing material, yes, we definitely drew from the collections at Harvard and the archives at the various parts of Harvard. We also tried to bring in things that were kind of seemingly less precious, but really held something that we could talk about and just sort of belonged to, were on the shelves of the participants who were interviewed. And I think maybe Linda actually, and I don't know if you want to talk about this, had maybe the most interesting experience when it comes to sourcing material and objects and where you kind of pull that from in the publication.
That was definitely an adventure. I think I have to credit, though, Ines Zalduendo for kind of pointing us to things that might be of interest. The things that are yet to come as items we might find of interest or want to archive. We were fortunate enough to be put in touch with Franziska Hoskins' son, who kept many of her documents, both just after and prior to her departure from the GSD, if I remember that correctly. Date-wise, that might be wrong, but anything else on that anyone would like to add?
Maybe just can add that, and also thinking of what also Nicolás said before about what, in future this idea of object can be, is that we actually have a category at the CCA that being also a collecting institution, the collection hates that is called the invented object. So sometimes we actually don't have an object that's an exhibition that actually will support that concept or that idea. And I create a drawing or doing something like that. Is sometimes we will really invent an object. Like, so in a show, for example, just to say briefly, years ago, we wanted to express the idea of a project that was not built, and one of the main features of the project was actually a very large neon sign that will basically welcome the people coming to Canada with the boat. And so in the description of the project, there was this gigantic neon that will be seen in the fog and so on. And I thought it was like incredibly, and this will not come out in the drawing, it was just in the letter in the archive. And so at the end, what we actually put in the gallery was actually a recreation of that neon sign. It was actually an object that we created to that had the context and the project. So I don't know. I don't want to do an object, but maybe also the idea of archival, and might become archival, and because you have then there then something that's maybe in essence.
Yeah, you know, that's also, I mean, one of the on one of the interviews that we're working for the next issue, the conversation started in a way talking about an archive that's coming to the school, but that quickly became a conversation about kind of works of architecture and almost a kind of visual exchange between the interviewer and interviewee. And so in a way, we are publishing archival material from this collection, but at the same time, we're publishing it in a way that really is reflective of this this double conversation that is both, you know, verbal and written, and then also visual, and trying to communicate that as part of this kind of process of talking and trying to generate something with a conversation rather than just spit.
Yeah, I think also one thing I wanted to say, you know, this idea of an invented object is really fascinating. I think, you know, part of this conversation is also giving ourselves a chance to reflect on what we just created and maybe kind of think about where it could go, because we haven't had a lot of time to think about what we're doing in some sense. And so, you know, I think that idea of an invented object is so fascinating and not really, I think, something we had thought about. So, I mean, I don't know if it's sort of fair to ask you this, but is there sort of a direction that you think, or you would hope that like future editorial teams might consider objects, given, you know, your experience as chief curator and now director of, like you say, like a large organization that, you know, is so focused on collecting sort of, I guess the in part objects that represent design and architecture.
I think you have already a large a kind of breadth of different objects in the magazine, but I think you should never feel limited of like, I think any objects that can support the idea that you want to express is the perfect object. So, you know, it's like when for example, I work with Mirko on this exhibition on the oil crisis, we started to collect on eBay tons of toys that were actually board games that will actually be connected with the politics of oil, the kind of power around oil. And doing that, then we started to find also board game that in the same period, like end of the 70s, were actually already transitioning to more, you know, alternative energy. So the kind of logic of like the power around oil and fossil fuels and extraction and so on became like a kind of sort of like monopoly where you will be rewarded if you actually didn't consume all your battery that day, whatever, you know, like that was interesting to use the toys as a way of illustrating and a kind of shifting culture. So for us, it was important to say how in a kind of also in a more general way, in a kind of popular way, and in the homes, like this shifting culture was happening, and so toys were the ways of understanding a kind of change in sensibility regarding those issues. So I think is that precision that I think is already there in what you're doing, is that to actually precisely choose that object, and you should feel like maybe, hey, budget is a way of talking of other things, or I don't know, a WhatsApp chat. I have no idea of but I think you should not feel limited in a way that even the representation of architectural discourse or thinking has to have something directly connected to architecture somehow. Yeah, I don't know.
I think also on that point, one of the things I think that we hope to achieve with this is just making people aware of things that are out there, and sort of broadening this sort of scope of knowledge. I think all the way back to when we were conceiving of this as a project, I think one of the sort of chief drivers of this was that we wanted to create something that was mining the sort of breadth of what the school has available and that people don't necessarily know is there. I think going forward, some of the things we would like to be looking into are past thesis projects of, so many storied people have gone to the GSD, and there's been so much work that's produced there, and you'll encounter in books from time to time that a particular studio happened, and it all becomes kind of some of the folklore of the school, if you will, but it's not always at the forefront or readily available to the students to consider this kind of accumulation of history that has gone on in the place. And I think that's a really sort of critical aspect of this, is to try to open up the possibilities and the awareness of places to look for that history and that knowledge.
I'd like to pose a question that sort of relates to this ongoing discussion. It seems to dovetail in nicely. And it says, springboarding from one of Vlad's comments that the journal is both retrospective and projective, can you point to an example of something in the first issue that you see as projecting forward? And, to kind of dovetail that in something that may make it meta as well, how do you project forward then for the future of the publication itself? And are those two things mutually exclusive? Are they different? What do you envision for this moving forward?
Well, being how it was something that I said, I'll take the first stab at it. But I think in my interview with Jennifer Bonner, there's a sort of instance of how these two sort of opposites are connected, where we're looking back at a time when Max Gagen was chair of the Department of Architecture from, I think, 1990 to 1995. And we're specifically looking at the object in that case of that conversation was a seminar booklet for a course that Dave Hickey taught at the GSD in 1994. And I think we used that as a means for talking about another moment in time in the school. The booklet itself is a bit racy. I mean, they're designing. You can't really quite tell what it's all about, but it appears to be that they're designing some kind of sex club or something of that nature. And I think we use that as a vehicle to talk about the GSD at present day and how this particular object is evidence of a time when, maybe a pre-internet time, when there weren't as many concerns about how this, seminar booklet might have been received, that it was just a more sort of experimental time for the school. And so we used that as a vehicle to start talking about experimentation in Jennifer's most recent option studio last spring, which was the semester where we shifted mid-semester from physical school to Zoom school. And so it was talking about just how methodologies had to change for herself as an educator in that context. And also, I think that was a studio that she co-taught with Hanif Kara, and it was talking about how, these types of different realms of knowledge might be able to cross-contaminate and form new sort of studio briefs where two different people are both kind of bringing their their sort of focus to the studio and then shaping the projects from two different angles. And so a kind of long answer to justify what I was trying to say of how it can be both at the same time.
But maybe I'll add that I think that point about being retrospective and projective is very tied, I think, to how we think as designers, generally speaking. I think as long as we as designers have some kind of interest in the past, I at least think that interest is always very projective. And I think we don't always notice that difference in the way that we look at the past and the way that maybe historians actually do, because I think as designers, we have this kind of incessant or this like constant urge of, well, let me make something, right? And so every time you look at something, you're looking at it and then you're like, well, maybe if this is useful to make that, whether that's a more abstract or more like not such a direct thought, or it's more direct. I think we're always putting ourselves in relation to that other thing that or that other moment that we're trying to access. And so I think that's really what every conversation is about. But I even one of the conversations that I thought was really exciting was the conversation Kim had with Zarazoda, because they were looking at these documents and these representations and started to talk about Sarah's interest in Olmsted and all the kind of connections that were there. But ultimately, I think both Kim and Sarah's interest came out in the interview as well, isn't it exciting that if we look at this, what that makes us think about our origins and then what this can mean about the future, and how maybe we've lost part of the story. And if we bring it back, then we can make something else of like how this discipline can continue to evolve, and maybe we can validate and strengthen some concerns that are already in the air. And so I think that's what that means when I kind of hear Vlad say it.
That's great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does that seem right? Okay. How did you manage to kind of collect and relate together your interviewees, your interviewers, and your objects? Because I think that speaks a lot to the nature of the conversations that you get as a result. There has to be some kind of an intuition that goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to describe it quite literally, I mean, when we were coming up with the table of contents for issue 1, this was when we still had kind of the opportunity to be together in the same space. Though admittedly, Vlad was studying abroad at that point, but everyone else, Linda, Kyle, Mark, Nicolás, and I were able to be in the same room. And I think we made lists and they were all independent lists. We made lists of people that we would really like to have a conversation with, to hear from. We made objects that we thought were fascinating, just kind of on their own accord. And then we made a list of questions that we had, whether they be specific design questions or kind of larger societal questions, ecological questions, personal kind of life progression kind of questions, I guess, considering that everyone is sort of on the cusp of graduating. And we printed those 3 lists, cut them up into individual pieces of paper, and then just sort of started moving them around on a table. And we were quite loose about it. And we just tried out different combinations until we found one that we thought fit. And there was a certain amount of serendipity, I think, that was built into the table of contents just from that process. And we ended up, pinning on a wall potential combinations, and then sort of just ask ourselves if it felt right. And then if it did, we would ask who we thought would be, the best paired with it, amongst the 6 of us. And so I think that's really how that process came together. And I guess I hope, and maybe it does sort of show through when you read the table of contents.
It's kind of a beautifully analog counterpart to the virtual format that we ultimately use to produce some of them.
Yeah. And we really got that in under the wire, I think. It's just...
Yeah, right there. Right before we started doubting whether this was a project worth doing at all in the middle of all of this that was going on. But so I wanted to maybe end by thanking once again everyone that Kim mentioned that has been an instrumental part in this, as well as all those people that might be here or not that know they played some role of encouragement, support, or guidance in this project, of which there are many, and we hope have all been thanked in the print version of the journal. But also thank Giovanna, which has really been a pleasure for us to talk with you and to really use this space to keep thinking about this and not only give some insight about what this is like for the students, but also share some of the questions that I think we all have and some of what we learned through this process. We're very happy to have had you here for this, and I'm not sure if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to make.
Thanks, Nicolás, and Kimberley, Vladimir, Linda, and Sarah, as I said, of instigating, and I'm sure all the other people who working on this. I think it's very exciting. I think we are confronted with a new platform, and that I think is very open and precise. And I will say, I shared this with you, but when I got it in my hands, in the same days, I learned a new Italian words that was actually used by an important editor when they will receive, and was a quality they will give to some of the manuscript. And it's called prima voltità. So in Italian, first time is prima volta. So it will be first timeness somehow. And so he felt like that's the quality of something that is done for the first time and has that kind of freshness, has that, it's kind of like no fear, sort of like enthusiasm of doing it, but also with that preciousness that is the first time you have done something. And I think your pairs has all those qualities of like being a kind of first time for you, is the first issue of the magazine, is a kind of new start for the school. And then I think is an issue of like how the next editors are able to keep that kind of quality alive. But yeah.
Absolutely. And then maybe on that note, I'll thank everyone who has joined us tonight. And we hope that anyone that has any further questions or questions that remained unanswered will contact us on the publication's Instagram or through the GSD email, because we would be glad to continue talking about this with whoever's interested. So thank you all, and have a good night.